Kofi Annan, one of the most well-known Secretary Generals of the United Nations in the 20th century, made the statement, arguing against globalization is like arguing against the laws of gravity. If this statement, that globalization has been inevitably true, then it follows that the events of the past 300 years were part of a chain that created the interdependent, interwoven global world of today. However, the world of today is not the world that existed 50 years ago. Movements like the Industrial Revolution, nationalism, imperialism, and militarism helped create the climate for a more global world, where events like the World Wars and the interwar period have hindered its expansion. Military conflicts, political priorities, and economic challenges put a halt to the advancements of globalization. The Industrial Revolution was a period of significant change throughout the world because of the advancements in technology that were made and the demand for overseas resources. Specifically, the invention of the steam engine enabled people to travel long distances and led to improved manufacturing. By extension, these inventions launched the beginning of a more global reach by individual countries and changed the nature of their economics. In addition to expanding one's country's reach over another, it also raised a sense of national pride, which became known as nationalism. Nationalism took the world by storm because it promoted countries to build new nation-states with the goal of establishing empires. Having tasted the power of nationalism, those in charge wanted more and aggressively began imperializing other countries. The intent of imperializing other countries was to spread one's country's way of life to another's, thereby expanding its culture, politics, religion, and economy. Militarism, which was the advancements in weapons, was a direct outgrowth of the joint impact of the Industrial Revolution, nationalism, and imperialism. The Industrial Revolution gave countries the ability to expand their economies and cultures. Nationalism made people feel more patriotic, and from that came the desire to imperialize and take ownership of other lands. This time period, from the late 18th century to the First World War, directly pushed forward the progression of globalization due to the invention of new technologies, the amount of resources being distributed throughout the world, and countries want to dominate and control those countries that are less developed. Although World War I was sparked by the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the real catalyst of the war was the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution created the machinery needed to produce more powerful weapons, nationalism about the rise of national pride, and gave countries a sense that they were better than others. As a result, they believed it was their right to expand their borders and exert power over others, and this movement was called imperialism. The formation of alliances contributed to the scale of the war because all of the countries in Europe joined in and took sides. During the war, the existence of the alliances created a domino effect. Once one country went to war, they all followed. World War I, or the Great War, ended in a way that resulted with certain countries having no money and no resources. After the war, countries in Europe went into an economic depression and people felt they needed to change their government and how things were getting done. People's desire for change ultimately led to fascism. They were so desperate for strong leadership they were willing to accept almost anything. Essentially, fascism is extreme nationalism with a single ruler and requires loyalty to the state and obedience to that ruler. The emergence of fascism began unraveling the forces of globalization that were established before World War I because there is little trust between countries, they are deep in debt, and citizens have lost trust in their government. These issues result in a global contraction and had the effect of creating trenches between countries, inhibiting the spread of globalization. The dissatisfaction and desperation underlying the fascist movement created the opportunity for Hitler's rise to power, and in turn, his rise to power led in part to World War II. Many of the factors that influenced how World War II played out were the result of the relationship between Hitler and the rest of Europe. For example, France and Great Britain's passive reaction to Hitler's advances on the Rhineland resulted in him looking more powerful to the people of Germany. Those countries' passive responses to Hitler's aggression, or the way they appeased him, indirectly gave him more power and made him hungry for more. Their appeasement of his actions created a feeling of stronger nationalism, which gave him more support from the people of Germany and is a potent example of this action-reaction relationship. On the other side of the world, another battle was being fought between the United States and Japan. After months of intense fighting and requests for Japan's surrender, the United States made one of the biggest military decisions of all time and dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The immediate destruction aside, the war fought in Asia changed the relationship between the United States and Japan for decades. Hitler strongly believed in the primacy of the Aryan race and began his push to eradicate anyone who was different. Initially, there was a system of profiling instituted, which led to Jews being identified and excluded. The profiling created the ability for Germans to harass the Jews, take their businesses and belongings, and force them to live in ghettos. The ghettos where the Jews were relocated before the emergence of the labor camps. The death-left labor camps were the next stage of the systematic eradication where Jews were forced to work long hours, had little food to eat, were subject to torture, and in the end were killed. World War II was a war fought largely about human rights and control and divided the world. The philosophical divisions and the economic impacts of a war fought around the world were additional hindrances to the early step towards globalization that had started in the previous century. The Cold War is defined as the time after World War II when the United States and the USSR were on the brink of war and characterized as a period of conflict, tension, and competition between the two countries. From the mid-1940s through the 1990s, these two countries competed with each other to be the biggest superpower by investing in military technology and industrial innovations. The Cold War in and of itself hindered globalization, but there are two events in particular that specifically impacted the spread of globalization. The Iron Curtain speech given by Winston Churchill and the Cuban Missile Crisis were the two events that added significant tension between NATO, which is made up of the US, Great Britain, and France, and the Warsaw Pact, that included the Soviet Union, Poland, and East Germany. The Iron Curtain was a term coined by Winston Churchill to describe the situation that existed in Germany. In a speech given a year after World War II ended, Winston Churchill said, "From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has ascended across the continent. Behind that line lay all the capitals of the Asian states of Central and Eastern Europe." This statement describes the very aggressive approach the USSR had taken to controlling its boundaries and resources and illustrates its political and economic attitude towards communism and democracy. Churchill believed the USSR was a threat to democracy and that non-communist countries needed to fend off communism and fight for democracy. The Cuban Missile Crisis, on the other hand, was a crisis of a very different kind and the closest the world has ever come to nuclear war. Once a resolution was reached between the US, USSR, and Cuba, the trust between Cuba and US was lost forever. The President of the United States at the time, John F. Kennedy, instituted a trade embargo with Cuba that severely impacted Cuba's economy. To this day, Cuba has not really recovered. The relationship between Cuba and the United States is still very fragile. The trade embargo and the Iron Curtain are two events added to the list of actions that hindered and impeded the forward progress of globalization. Individually, the Industrial Revolution, nationalism, imperialism, and militarism were powerful movements that contributed to the beginning of an interconnected global world. That being said, the culmination of the four led the world into one of the most destructive wars ever fought and nearly shattered all of the advances made previously. It would take decades and never before imagined technology to reassemble the puzzle pieces of the world.